Welcome back to Crypto University. My name's Adam. We're going over a topic adjacent to cryptocurrency, the global economy of developed countries. I've made a bunch of graphs. In the end, what we're going to talk about is demographics, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, share of the economic pie. We're going to talk about CEO pay. We're going to talk about the devaluation of the US dollar relative to gold. We're going to try to tie this all together into a cohesive story. What's happened that made baby boomers overall chance into a good amount of success, where they're now scratching their heads wondering what's happening to these younger generations. Younger generations had a better start. The economy has changed massively. That's the main difference. So let's go over demographics first of all. Left side is Canada, right side is the US, 2015, it's a little bit old here. And you can see this band around the 60s at the time, and that is the baby boomers, and their children are millennials. Although millennials are now the same size as the baby boomers were a larger generation. As time goes on, you can see people passing away even here as we get older. Into the later ages of the baby boomers, there's already a significant amount of them who have passed away. Okay. So who shows up to voting? This is 2024 elections, so very recent. Who's going to show up to vote? We have 94% of the baby boomers are about to show up. It's a huge cohort, very dedicated to voting. I'm going to make the claim that the reason they're much more committed and less cynical because the economy has worked out for their working careers and onwards. Like, it seems like, although they're being stretched the dollar right now, inflation's going up, they're still able to make ends meet. And so they've grown up in a different perspective on what it means to be involved in an economy, what it means to work for a corporation for 30 or 40 years, and what it means to vote and have your interests protected. The baby boomers have both economic and political power, and they're holding on to it as long as possible, which again, I don't blame them, anyone would. But when that happens, obviously it demotivates other younger, smaller cohorts of voters. Midterms for the US, 2022, again, who has already voted or definitely will. And again, we see that the major baby boomer cohort, very big, come out to vote. Gen X's coming out to vote, millennials faltering around 60%. Why are these people showing up to vote and why are some not? Baby boomers benefited from the post-World War II era where the US was the single pole superpower of the world and dictated agreements, bilateral agreements and trade agreements, and was really able to dominate, having the dollar be the reserve currency with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, as well as setting up standards of trade with the rest of the world. As a result, the baby boomers, a big cohort, came into a booming economy for a lot of these developed countries. The war was over, technological advancements, followed by peace and prosperity. So in the 1990s, the baby boomers were around 35 years old or so and had approximately 21% of the economic pie. We see that the millennials are quite a big generation as well because they are the children of the boomers. So they are also 35 years old, but they're going to have a total of less than 5% of the total generational pie. And you can see Gen X here also struggling, doing better than millennials, but not nearly as far as the baby boomer cohort. Of course, Gen X is a much smaller demographic. So we would obviously, like, these numbers per person are actually much higher than the millennials. The millennials, it's even worse when you're looking at it because the millennials are a bigger number of people. So they're sharing this 5%. This is important for understanding the economy and purchasing power. Even though there's more money in the system now and millennials are earning than baby boomers. So baby boomers are like, I start out with $35,000 a year and some millennials are starting $80,000 a year. The pool of money has grown so much more in that time and the wages haven't kept up. Millennials are fighting for houses at $1.5 million with their $80,000 a year, which is a different story than fighting for a house at $300,000 or $250,000 at $35,000 a year, or even less, like $150,000 for a house, depending on if you're in rural America. This is just putting the household wealth by generation. You can see when they were in their 30s, right? Look at the wealth they have, right? We're getting up to that 21% range, whereas millennials are about 5 now. So where the boomers were in the 1990s, the millennials are not anywhere close to the overall percentage. The millennials are trying to use this amount of money to fight for housing and vacations and cars in the economy where other people have these amounts of money. This is obviously a major issue for them. We can see millennials earning up to a certain point here in Gen X. This was the 2008 recession that took everyone's money down, especially in mortgages. Baby boomers have a lot of real estate. They were affected strongly, but we've since recovered. The wealth has gone to the baby boomers in such a high degree because mortgages and housing was eventually protected. I understand a lot of boomers got washed out of their mortgages, but if the majority of people have their main economic value inside of a house and they're the main voting bloc, you can understand that governments around the world are going to be incentivized to make sure that they can retain their houses and have their housing value grow at the expense of other people. If we inflate the monetary supply, We can have housing go up and up, which of course, if you own a house, you've already captured those gains. But everyone else now, they're being paid in cash and they don't have an asset. They're trying to chase those rising prices with their money. And if their income levels are not keeping up with the overall rising of costs in the economy, which is what we're seeing right now, they're trying to use their income that is higher than the 1990s or the 1970s, but is pittance compared to how much the overall economy has grown. They're trying to use that money to buy assets that are growing more at the speed of how the economy is growing, or rather the devaluation of the dollar is growing. So here we go again. Silent generation concedes to the baby boomers, like X to millennials. The boomers have been on a secular bull run. The boomers and Gen X to some degree were able to capture the secular bull run that happened preceding the 2008 financial crisis. Whereas the millennials were not positioned well enough yet to take advantage of that. We're seeing rising costs of living as well as stalling out of certain housing markets, stalling out at a high price. As the millennials are having trouble tracking that now. They weren't able to ride the 15-year bull run. Putting this in perspective, baby boomers' principal residence values, the mortgage you owe, and income. Baby boomers earned less than millennials. Millennials have more, but look at mortgages. For baby boomers, mortgages were closer to their after-tax income. Whereas the millennials, the mortgages are much farther away. And of course, the underlying value of the house is, let's say, double at this point in time. So this is Canada in particular. This is actually much different than the US. You can see that the US home prices fell down and remain down, whereas Canada, likely due to heavy immigration policy, the housing prices have gone way up. The issue that Canada has is it has much less competitive cities. Tier 2 cities in Canada are being moved to at a higher, because people have moved out of cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. It's too expensive for them to live for the most part. But there's not enough alternative cities in Canada that are highly connected. It's a broad land mass and freezing in many places. Many immigrants and native Canadians, including myself, don't want to move to Calgary or Edmonton or Manitoba. The quality of the city is much less than a Toronto or Vancouver because they're less developed and populous. I'm not throwing shade at those cities. They can be wonderful places. I've never been, but the value isn't there specifically for immigrants. In America, you've got many higher tier cities with 1 million or more people. As a newcomer or as someone who's a citizen, can feel comfortable moving to an adjacent city with airports and railways connecting roads, highways. Whereas Canada, it's just not as much. So this makes, I think what's happening is our housing prices are suffering because we have high immigration, but everyone wants to only live in a few cities, which makes obviously it much more competitive to get housing, and that will bring up the entire country's average housing by quite a lot. So that's my theory. I know people in America want to live in major metropolises. I understand. It's just I feel like they've got the choice to choose second tier cities, like not the main cities, and still feel comfortable and still feel like they're getting value. Whereas in Canada, it's a lot less iffy to move out of these major population centers because the country is less developed. What's the result? Baby boomers are giving their kids money. I've had my mother has helped subsidize my residence as well by allowing me to take over a mortgage for her on a pre-built condo. I wouldn't have been able to afford that without her. I'm not living there. I have tenants because it's still really expensive for me to live in that unit. Pre-death transfers of wealth have become common, both millennials and Gen Z. And there's another statistic, like millennials were living in the house up to age 30, so they can afford to remain in their communities and afford a house. So switching gears in U.S. national debt, these numbers are actually a bit weird because the debt's going up, but the numbers here are lower than this one. But I think they're at 36 trillion at the time of recording now. So we've had even more data. They're rising by $1 trillion every 100 days at this point. A lot of it is paying off the interest of their debt. Over the past 100 years, whether 1920 to 2020 or 1923 to 2023, the US added its first $1 trillion after, whatever time, I guess the Pareto principle, like 80-20 rule, like at 80% time did they finally add their first $1 trillion. But after they added the first $1 trillion, the second $1 trillion came after 8 years and 4 years, and then it's 2 years. And now they're up to, it's going exponential. Now it's every 100 days. So you have to ask the question, is this the demarker of a healthy economy? It is not. The one thing that America has as its advantage right now is that many other countries are also suffering because they're dollarized, but to other degrees because the economy overall is dependent on America and China, and those countries are not doing well. But in a way they are doing well. They're posting record profits. Of course, they're posting record profits in a devaluing dollar. Facebook is worth more than ever, but those dollars are worth less. There's a spell that's being cast on us so far as we're seeing that, income earners the top income earners are getting more than ever before. I don't think inflation explains all of that. Big companies are making more than ever, producing more. Inflation or devaluation doesn't explain all of it, but it explains a huge chunk to not understand that is to miss a large part of the conversation. America is very polarized in politics. Canada is becoming too, partly because of America. You guys have made things more interesting here, but in all honesty, it's worse. We're following the American playbook. It's actually happening here. There's radicalization on the left and the right, as I've seen in America. I've followed since about 2015, 2016, this interested me. And I'm seeing it happen a lot more here in Canada. But the reason why I brought this up was to just say that no matter whether it's the left or right, the Republicans or the Democrats, the spending keeps going up, and Trump, his second term, will probably continue this trend. It's just the U.S. national debt again. Looking at it from different numbers and statistics, the House of Representatives is a large governing body. We see images of them voting on propositions. The Senate is much smaller. I don't know how many senators they have. It's also elected. You can see the senators' age are more coalesced around the baby boomer age. So I want to paint this picture of baby boomers being politically and economically powerful and not letting go of either of those until their last moments. And again, I wouldn't expect them to do anything otherwise, but it's just, this paints a picture for us. The House is a little bit younger, and there's a lot more Gen X's involved in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, it skews towards baby boomers. The Senate can veto any bill that the House tries to represent. They can push it back and delay it, so really strong power the Senate has. Age of U.S. presidents, again, Obama, an outlier here when he first took office, maybe just under 50 years old. And you've got Biden over here, you've got Trump's first presidency and Trump's second presidency. Overall, there's a trend upwards. And again, this is, I believe, the boomers overall exercising their power and their belief that their people speak to what they want, consolidating that power. Demographics of U.S. Supreme Court justice, this purple line is when they leave, and this is when they join. Although joining is relatively stagnant, the age at which they join the Supreme Court, the age at which they're leaving could be due to medical advances, but also I think less of them are voluntarily retiring. They stay until their tenure is over because death is going up. This would show you that the boomers are once again holding on to power for as long as possible. Now we're going to dive into the wealth gap. What does this mean in terms of demographics into numbers? This is the top 1% of US economy, wealth earners. The top 1% of wage group has seen this much rise in their relative income. The change in real annual wages, the top 1% has gone way up, has, even almost, they've over doubled what the top 1% has. So if you were to take out that 0.1% from the top 1% and draw their own line, it'd be even more impressive. The top three lines actually, so this dark blue all the way down to this second last one, this is all the top 10% of the economy. So the top 10% of the economy has this much a positive change in their wealth over time. And this is the bottom 9%. So you're probably more in the bottom 70, 60, and 50%. If we break this down and remove the 80 to 90 percentile, this line would get flat soon because you can see the trend just by looking at the top 10%. This is the rest of the 90%. We're going to see that the story for, it's not, you would assume what I'm going to say is like the lower income, the bottom 20%, but no, it's more like the bottom 50% of countries, specifically in the US, but I think it's similar in Canada. We'll look at a Canadian-based one being devastated. Millennials are skewing less conservative overall than what we'd expect voters to go through as they age. One theory is that voters age, they become more conservative because they have more wealth and families to look after, and they're less in line with appealing to and appeasing the more radical views of the change the younger generation wants. We're seeing millennials buck that trend, and it probably has to do with their upbringing, but also, and people talk about culture wars and stuff, but I think a major point will also just be the economy. Like, things are just not working for these people, so they're less likely to feel camaraderie with the way things are in these countries. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing here. I'm going to walk us through this as best I can. We've got two graphs here. Each colored block is a 20th of the population. This blue block is 20% of Canada, the lowest 20% of income earners, then the next lowest 20% of income earners, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. The actual number of the block is how much wealth those income earners have. The top 20% of Canada, in the ideal distribution, would have 30% of the entire country's wealth. The bottom 20% of income earners would have 11.5% of the economy. The second last income earners, that 20% of the population would have 14, and so on. So it's 5 times 20 is 100. So you've got 100% represented in five 20% demographic cohorts of income earners. So you split up the entire demographics. You're not talking about age, you're not talking about sex, you're just talking about income earners, and you're putting them into 20% buckets where they all have to fit into that 20% bucket. And then you're asking for the top 20% bucket how much wealth do they have? It's going to be more than 20% because this is the top earners. They have 50% of the wealth. Do they have 70% of the wealth? How much? This is the distribution Canadians think is ideal. The top 20% would have 30. So this is like basically the rich and the ultra rich. They would, the upper class, industry owners, and so on. The middle class would have 20 and 23%. Respectively. This is what Canadians think is happening. They think the rich and the ultra rich have 55% of the entire wealth of the country. You can see quite a bad story, actually. The bottom 60% of income earners have under 30% of the wealth. This is the actual situation. The bottom 20% of earners owe money. The bottom 40%, that 20% plus the next 20%, show up as a sliver. They're right here. They couldn't fit the number on the graph because it's so small. And then you've got what would be effectively the middle class having 9% of the entire economy. So this is the 40th to 60th percentile income earners. And the 60 to 80th percentile earner, which at 21. And then you've got like the rich and the ultra rich basically having almost 70% of the country's entire wealth. We're heading towards a dystopian future. The Pareto principle is something to look into. 20% of the roads get 80% of the traffic. 20% of the movies get 80% of the tickets purchased for them. There's a phenomenon, the Pareto principle. Vsauce did a great video on this, so I'd recommend watching that. This isn't too shocking, but still, even though this might be more of a law of nature, that wealth or any system eventually coalesces around the few and not the many. It still is quite disheartening when you look at how this cashes out into education, healthcare, like what it looks like to support your lower economy. At some point, it becomes very disruptive and cannibalistic. The rich and the ultra rich, by following the intuitions and desires that everyone else would have in their shoes, are ending up eroding the country from the bottom up. So just to put a finer point on that, so we've got growing CO to worker pay. So these are the different industries where worker pay is with CO pay. We've got 741 to 1 in consumer discretionary spending like clothing and cars. Consumer staples might be food, communication, information technology, healthcare. COs are over 100x what the average worker earns. And then you can look over to this chart and see what's happened that sometime between the 80s and 90s. And again, we can talk about this. Like this is when the baby boomers became adults and started owning stuff, right? And this is also coalesces with automation increasing, digitization, so productivity from digitization increasing, where everyone's using computers now, and they're saving things in Excel sheets instead of on paper in a filing cabinet. When I was young guy in the 1990s, I would still see filing cabinets at the dentist's office because we hadn't fully transitioned to a digital age. Now you just wouldn't see that at all. The benefit of moving from analog to digital was astounding. Companies were flooded with money. At the same time, Bill Clinton normalized trade relations with China in 1992, or at the end of his presidency. That allowed for these corporations who are lobbying the government to outsource manufacturing jobs from a place where they've got, human rights and environmental policy, like in the United States and Canada, to a much cheaper place where their energy is cheaper because they don't have the same human rights and environmental policies as we do. You increase your productivity a lot. You're producing more things for less money. You've got automation happening, which is now with AI still in the process of happening. The productivity of these companies and the job postings of these companies went up, but the trickle-down economy didn't work the way it was advertised, of course, because that wasn't the primary focus. The primary focus was for the people at the top with the money lobbying the government to get as much money as they could. The actual whole, this is going to make China more democratized, which was an argument that was made, that a rising tide floats all boats, rises all boats. We haven't actually seen that. And again, why would it happen? These people capture as much wealth as they can. CEO pay, indicative of top earners, shot way up in line with the S&P 500. These companies are posting record earnings. They are making more money, becoming more productive, making more for less. The typical worker's pay has stagnated for the past 30, if not 40 years. What you can actually buy with your money, that's stagnated. So here again, corporate profits versus employee compensation. Employee compensation relative to GDP has gone down. Whereas corporate profits have gone up relative to GDP. And who was in middle management by the time this started happening, where the total economy was moving at one clip, but the digital economy was expanding and exploding with baby boomers? They were the ones who were, there's all this new wealth being generated by all this new digital advancement, basically, through no fault of their own. Many of them were just there to ride along as the companies got super rich, and they have retirement savings that we won't. And so you see this come out toxically with millennials, there's a lot of okay boomer memes. There's a lot of these persons making more than me, even though I'm more educated than them and they don't know how to open a PDF. We shouldn't blame boomers. They've had their own struggles. There is a frustration from the younger group saying we are more technologically and intellectually advanced. We have more PhDs. We've spent more time studying. We feel like we're more capable, but we're simply not able to keep up with the economy and kill it in the same way that the boomers did over a 20 or 30 year period in their careers. This has nothing to do with what the millennials are doing wrong necessarily and what the boomers did right. It has to do with an economy that changed over time and an economy that benefited workers at a certain time and valued them and now does not. So this is the bottom 50% of US households, the wealth over all the households in the United States. And you can see that the wealth has not really grown much for the bottom 50% of all households in the United States. It's remained pretty stagnant. Look how much it got decimated in 2008. The only wealth that most people had was in real estate, and that got decimated. The top 50% has, if we look at the top 10%, which is the top 3 colors of green, look how much the top 10% has grown in terms of their wealth. It is astounding, right? They were much more in line. The sliver of yellow was closer, has remained fairly similar, but these bands have grown massively. So you can see an absolute disparity in who is capturing the wealth, specifically the top 10%, which probably isn't you or I. Flipping gears now from the wealth of the country to what the wealth actually means. The US got off the gold standard. I think this is the Nixon year. The Bretton Woods Agreement was signed over here. Oh, I shouldn't have said the 1970s. So the getting up the gold standards was 71. That's what I meant to say. Bretton Woods, right after World War II, where they established US as the world reserve currency. You can see how much a dollar could get you. In 13, a dollar could buy 13 Hershey's chocolate bars. In 1933, you could get 10 bottles of beer for $1, and now that would cost you $20. 1944, you could get 20 bottles of Coca-Cola for $1. Now that would cost you $14.71. The dollar's value is eroding, and there is a consequence that, of course, asset prices then go up because everything is valued in dollars. A house worth $500,000 gets to $1.5 million in 20 years. This happens. And of course, when you're devaluing the dollar, you are going into debt that is then going to be leveraged against a younger generation. This is gold's value, which is a static asset as the value, the currency gets devalued. You can see the inflation rate going up, which is in red, and then the gold value start ticking up. And there is some sort of correlation there that I would not be surprised is also causative. There's a causation happening there. You can also see gold versus purchasing power of the US dollar. And again, we see some relation where the dollar started to falter. I think this would be around the 2008 recession. And then what's happened afterwards is big quantitative easing for the past 15 years. I use dollars relative to gold. So this is kind of the last bit that I'm going to talk about here. This is from Ray Dalio's picture of civilizations as they rise and fall. You can look at civilizations, specifically the Roman Empire, which we know devalued their currency. What happened? So there's a new world order after some sort of world war or major conflict. This was America's time from 44, 45 onwards. Peace, prosperity, growth. This was more than the world's ever seen happening here because we went from analog to digital. All the new technologies opened up for us. Eventually, you get into a debt bubble and a big wealth gap. My theory here as to why this happens is because there is not a trickle-down economy. This productivity, people in power use their power to consolidate their power, to sequester both political and economic power away from everyone else. This is naturally how humans operate. If you try to stand in the way of this, you will eventually get crushed because they're leveraging both political and economic power against you. The country stops investing in itself. The wealth gets moved over to the wealthy, and this can happen through taxation as well as inflation. We've got an economic bust and a downturn. Ray Dalio says we're here now. We kind of already had the bust happen in 2008, and we're just on this downturn now, and he's suggesting that China is a rising power that's going to surpass and replace the United States. He thinks the United States had their heyday around 1955. And things have gotten worse for that empire. Very scary thought. Obviously, China doesn't have the same values as us, but China has a lot of economic for itself right now. So hopefully, maybe that will slow down the change of the world order. I just wanted to add this last part in, which was how jobs, the types of jobs affected by outsourcing. I think we're seeing manufacturing jobs were affected, and information technology jobs are now being affected specifically by AI. It's getting kind of scary. I'm in web development, so I can see that there's going to be less need for the average coder. If you are a god tier coder, and a developer will always be needed for a very long time, but if you're of average skills, it's going to get harder and harder to retain a job going forward. And then administrative jobs, eventually managerial jobs might be replaced as well. Where does this lead us? We're in culture wars. I think that the culture wars in Canada, in the United States, are primarily economic in nature, but they talk about everything but the economy. They talk about transgender rights, educating kids about sex, abortion, any topics that aren't about raising the minimum wage. They are in the spotlight. This is conspiratorial in a way, but I also think maybe this is actually happening on purpose. If you can disgruntle the middle class and the lower 50% of the entire population, they're going to be disgruntled economically because things are costing more, they're earning less, they're going to be angry. But if you can get them to channel that anger on attacking each other over a culture war, you can get away with it for as long as possible. If you are part of the ruling elite, leeching them of all their wealth and prosperity, you don't want them lucidly talking about this point. You would rather have them talk about anything but that. And I think that's what we're basically seeing happen. As a result of this, though, men we're seeing dropping out. So this is men 25 and older. So this includes all the men who were educated before women really started entering university. And even then, women have now overtaken them because there have been so many more women getting educated than men, so getting a university degree. And then if you just take men who are in the millennial age and Gen Z age, they're just dropping out. Specifically, Gen Z is just dropping out. So millennials were the last cohort to really believe that education was something. And even then, there was a lot of skepticism. Now, many men, this is a very existential, fatalistic, and cynical viewpoint why they're dropping out. They don't believe they can follow this predefined path and get the lifestyle and family, like attract women in the way that has been working for the past century. They don't believe this is going to work for them, so they're just dropping out. They're staying at home playing video games and doing drugs. How does this cash out in terms of sex and dating? Young men are driving the decline in sex, so there has been a decline in sex, but no sex in the past year. We're seeing almost 30% of men having no sex in the past year, and this wasn't how it was like in the 90s and the 2000s. It's just gotten much worse. So there is just a level of cynicism related to online dating as well, but these men don't feel like they have the ability to attract mates, and they're kind of dropping out of society. So again, the last picture I'll say is that we have a society where if you're rich, there's nothing you can do. This is kind of systematic failure of the economy, working for the average person. And what we're seeing is that the wealth is being accumulated and the rich are kind of ignorant of the overall impacts of this, and eventually it could destroy society as we know it. And, it's resulted in the culture wars, and I think it's only going to get worse, but we'll see. Thank you for joining me. I didn't talk about crypto, but hopefully this relates to crypto. If you can, moving your currency from a state-issued currency, which is dominated by political actors, bought by corporations and interest groups. If you can move your economic value from there to somewhere else that is out of the reach of them, you might be interested in doing that. This is Crypto University. My name's Adam. Thanks for watching. Take care.